Welcome to another episode of the Beyond Jaws podcast, and I'm your co-host, Dave Ebert. I'm filling in doing what Andrew usually does to introduce an episode, a new episode, but today is kind of a special one for me. It's a bonus episode where I'm going to give a little bit of a talk about my former advisor, Dr. Leonard Campagno, who is really a giant in the field of shark biology, shark ecology, shark taxonomy. It's a little bit of a celebration of life, sort of a little bit of a goodbye from me to Leonard. And so I hope you enjoy the show. I'm going to share some memories, some stories I've had with Leonard. Some of you may have heard of over the years. Now you have them for posterity. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the show, and we'll get started right now. And welcome back to another episode of the Beyond Jaws podcast. I'm your co-host, Dave Ebert, and here with my co-host, Andrew Lewin. And we're going to be talking a little bit. I'm going to be reminiscing, a little bit of a celebration of life episode for my former advisor, Dr. Leonard Campagno, who passed away on September 24th, 2024. And so I'm going to share some stories with you, talk a little about my experience with him. I knew Leonard for over 40 years. And going back to when I was a young master student, really starting out in the Bay Area in California here, and so we'll get started now. Okay, so I talk a little about Leonard. He was an interesting character, and can't be overstated sometimes, but he really was a giant in the field of shark biology, shark taxonomy. His classification of how we classified sharks and rays and chimeras or ghost sharks back in his paper he published back in 1973 called Interrelationships of Chondrichthyan Fishes really laid the groundwork for how we classify sharks and rays. And that classification is still used today. And actually molecular research done by Gavin Naylor and many others over the years have really found that his classification really holds up well. And back when he did this, he didn't have a lot of the modern tools such as genetics that we could use today. And so he was quite an interesting character. And he grew up in San Francisco in the Little Italy section, and he's born in 1943, December 4th. And a lot of people don't know that because he spent the last 35, almost 40 years in South Africa. And a lot of people thought he was South African. But he did grow up in the Bay Area. He went to San Francisco Community College, and he went on to San Francisco State, and from there to Stanford University. And some things that people don't often know is that Stanford University used to have one of the preeminent ichthyology collections in the world. And it was only in about 1979, 1980, they finally closed down the ichthyology department and sent all their specimens over to the California Academy of Sciences. And it was kind of funny because most of the people, the professors there, had either passed away or retired. And here Stanford University had this whole department open for one guy who was still a grad student. Leonard, I think, probably had the record for one of the longest PhDs. He was a student there for about 14, 15 years before he finally finished up his PhD.
That's got to be the longest for sure.
And he was just kind of squirreled away down in the basement there working away. And finally the biology department chair realized that they had this whole department open for a grad student, and then a 15-year grad student. And so he went down and he just said, "Hey, Leonard, we're closing up the department. You're going to need to finish up and get out, but we're closing the department." And Leonard told me the story, so I'm giving you a firsthand account on what he told to me. And so he went from there over to the Tiburon Marine Lab, which is just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco in Marin County. And over there, they had some old Army barracks. It had become a Marine Lab station for San Francisco State University, but it was really their old Army barracks, and it was old Army buildings from going back to World War II, because they basically had an Army group base there because they were concerned about Japanese ships coming into San Francisco Bay. And anyway, they sat vacant, and Leonard took over one of these buildings. I mean, he literally took it over. And I remember as a young grad student, I first started in the early 1980s, my professor at Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, Greg Kaye, said, you got to give Leonard Campagno a call and let him know you're going to be working up in San Francisco Bay, because I was going to work on 7-gill sharks, which were very common in San Francisco Bay. So, I was a young 22-year-old. I didn't know anything. I thought, oh, okay, great, I'll give Leonard a call. So I just kind of cold call this guy up, and I get this answer on the phone like, yeah, who is this? And I said, like, oh, hi, this is Dave Ebert. I'm a graduate student at Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, and I'm studying 7-gill sharks in the bay, and I'd like to know if I can come up and talk with you. He goes, oh, I haven't got time for this, and he hung up on me. And that was my first introduction to Leonard Campagno.
How old were you at this time?
I was 22.
How old were you at this time?
I was 22.
And that was your first, like, any kind of response from him, any kind of interaction with him.
First interaction with him, and I was like, whoa, that was a pretty cold and abrupt. And so I went back to Greg, and I said, Greg, this is what happened. I explained to him, and Greg looks at me and goes, well, Leonard can be a little eccentric. I thought, yeah, eccentric can be kind of rude. But so I went about, so I just was like, okay, well, clearly didn't want to talk to me or didn't want to talk to anybody. But I knew nothing about him at the time other than what Greg had told me. So I went about doing my thesis project, and probably about a year later, it was the winter time, and I was using the boat at San Francisco State there, going out to fish. And so I kind of knew he was based there, but I didn't know where he was based at the time. And I came in one day, I didn't, we're out fishing, and we caught a few spiny dogfish, nothing big. It was myself, my brother, and a good friend of mine out there fishing. We came in there, and it was just pouring rain, just cats and dogs. And so we're trying to clean up the boat, pick up the gear, and this guy walks by, and he kind of looks in the boat, and he sees these dogfish. I mean, nothing special. These are spiny dogfish, and he says, "Oh, yeah. Oh, what are you doing with those sharks?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Moss Landing Marine Laboratories. I'm studying sharks here in the bay." And he goes, "Oh, really? I didn't know anybody was studying sharks in the bay." And so clearly he forgot about it earlier.
You still had no idea who this was.
Well, at this point, I kind of knew. I'd never seen Leonard. I didn't know what he looked like.
Right.
And I thought but I knew he was there, and I thought I wonder if this is Leonard Campagno. And then he just started talking, and we spent about the next hour. I mean, it was just raining, and he never said "Hi, I'm Leonard Campagno." He never said, "Hey, let's go inside to get out of the rain." We stood there, and of course, I was probably might have been 23 at this time, and I was going "This is my end with chance to talk to Leonard Campagno." And so we stood there and for about an hour, and then finally, my brother and my friend go, "Hey, Dave, can we go get out of the rain? It's raining pretty hard here. We're soaked like rats." And I was like, yeah. Can I go? And I go I'm, by the way, my name's Dave Ebert. And he goes, "Oh, hi, I'm Leonard Campagno." He goes, "Why don't you come over to my office?" And I go, "Where is he?" He goes, "Well, it's that army barrack over there." And this guy would drive his beat up 1964 Black Beetle Bug VW. Go look online if you don't recognize it. Some people of a certain age know what I'm talking about. He'd drive it in there, and he'd close it, and you'd have no idea this guy was there. And so we went over there, and I spent another 2 hours talking with the guy. My brother and friend were there, and it was the most amazing experience I ever had, even though I was soaking wet, dripping. And he just went in there, and I looked in there, and I realized well, he lives here. He basically was living in there, had a cot. He had all these stations set up, the workstations he was using. And for those of you in the shark world, you'll know what I'm talking about. But he was working on the 1984 Sharks of the World book that was published by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. It's a classic reference that was published in 1984. And this is probably about late 82, winter of 82, 83, right in that time frame. And at the time, I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. He's working on this, shark. He told me about the project he was doing. He'd just been on this round the world tour and everything. And so I had an amazing visit. He said, "Oh, come up, stop in anytime you're up here." Well, obviously I wasn't going to pass on that because he was just a wealth of knowledge. It was literally having an audio version of the encyclopedia at the time. This guy could talk nonstop. And so I went up there and I met with, I would go up there when I was up there and stop in and visit with them. And for me, it was, and I've talked about this a little before in some of the earlier episodes, but, when you're traveling kind of in your journey in life, you're really fortunate if you meet somebody who's a fellow traveler on the same road you're embarking on. And Leonard was that guy that, I mean, it has some great people in my, that had met, Greg Kai is the top of the list, John McCosker, but Leonard was that fellow traveler. He was that guy who was on the road that I was steadying off on. And we just really connected really well. And it was an amazing experience. And so I got to know him, over the next, couple of years, going up there and talking with them. And sometimes I just go up there and spend literally when I say I've spent a few hours with them, they're more like anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, just talking nonstop.
Wow.
And it wasn't just sharks. We talk on rays, we'd talk on chimeras. And I was just like, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to learn. I was not focused on any one species, but I was wanted to learn about everything. And that's really laid the foundation for my search for lost sharks. And this is going back to the early 80s. This laid the foundation, Andrew, really, for where I went.
Yeah, I can imagine when you were talking with Leonard about these different species. Were you talking more about like the ecology, distribution, and that sort of aspect, or were you talking more about where to find them, where they are? Like the search for them, like where they could be found.
Well, at the time, the whole field of shark research was just really, modern shark research was really the groundwork was being laid. And as I've mentioned before, like myself, Lisa Natanson, Chris Lowe, Greg Scommel, we were like really as I've said, the Jaws generation of young shark researchers really started in the 80s. And we really laid the foundation for what came later in the terms of sharks. So a lot of the stuff people talk about, like shark conservation, they throw that term around now. It wasn't even a term at that time. It wasn't even anybody's mind. It more had to do with fisheries at the time. But we talked about like sharks. We knew at that point that sharks were slow growing and long lived, but nobody really knew anything about, how old they get or how many young they have or where they go. And so all of that we were starting to lay the groundwork for that. And Leonard was that guy. We could talk on all kinds of stuff. We talked on taxonomy. We talked on ecology, life history. And I'll tell you a story in just a moment, just to give you an idea. But Leonard was that guy who would think outside the box. I mean, he really would think of things that people weren't even on the lexicon yet at the time. And during as I got to know him and stuff, and he was, like I said, at the time he was looking for a job. He was in his early 40s at the time, and he got a job in South Africa, interestingly, at the South African, or actually nowadays it's the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, but at the time it was known as the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology. And for those of you that don't know, J.L.B. Smith was the guy who discovered the coelacanth back in 1938, old four legs it was called.
Right.
And so that was his sort of name recognition. And J.L.B. passed away in 1968, but his wife, Margaret Smith, which is a whole story I'll tell in just a moment, she actually drove and got this whole funding and everything for what was later called the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology, which opened in about 1980, 79, 80, I believe it was. Or actually, I think it might have been it might have been 77, 78, say late 70s when it opened, when it officially opened. But anyway, Leonard got a job at this place, and this is in about 1985. And I'd finished my master's and I was looking around what I was going to do, and I was working a few different jobs, but I was still going up there collecting data and still going up there to see Leonard. And when he told me he was taking this job, I went up there and saw him and, kind of say goodbye. And I've told this story before, but as I was kind of leaving and saying goodbye, I said, well, hey, Leonard, if you need anybody to carry a suitcase or anything, give me a call. And it's a complete throwaway line. You think nothing, you'll never, good luck. I'll never, maybe see him sometime in 20 years. Well, about 8 months after, he calls me up from South Africa and says, hey, Dave, I have a PhD position here at it was Rhodes University, but it was J.L.B. Smith Institute. He goes, I have a PhD position. Would you like it? And, it took me like a nanosecond to say, like, hell yeah. I'm on the way. And so it was just one of those crazy things in life.
What year was this?
This was in 1985. he called me up, and I went to
that.
South Africa. I went to South Africa in '86. So I had to go through and apply for the school. I had to get all the paperwork together, the visa and all that type of stuff, which took me about 9 months to do. I'm actually closer to a year actually, but I finally went in '86, and it was the most transformative time of my life. And again, to kind of put perspective in it, people certain age will understand this, but at that time, South Africa wasn't a place people were generally clamoring to go through because it was on the world stage. There's apartheid was going on, and there's a lot of stuff going on at the time. And here I am, like, sure, I'm going to go to South Africa, and that was all I knew, is I'm going to South Africa. I'm going to go study sharks. That's all I cared about, because I was really fulfilling a dream. And I've shared some of these adventures. I won't go into all of them today, but I have a number of adventures I had at the time that were very life changing. And I kind of tell the story. Like, it was on basically like a 4+ year camping trip when I went to South Africa. And I literally had not been there, didn't know anything about it other than what Leonard told me. And so I just literally got on a plane and I went. And it was an amazing experience. And I got to Grahamstown, and then I got set up, got going right away, was out in the field looking for stuff. And kind of the funny story is, in Grahamstown is I come from a small town in California. I thought, oh, great, now I'm in another small town and rural town in South Africa. And the reason this institute was there is because J.L.B. Smith was based at Rhodes University. And so another side story of the whole thing is, when I was first there, my first Christmas there, I was house sitting for Margaret Smith, whose husband, J.L.B. Smith, was the guy that did the coelacanth. And of course, Margaret was actually 20 years younger than him, and she was she had been a chemistry student of his, because he used to teach chemistry as well back in the 30s when they got married. And so she recounted the whole story to me. I was house sitting for her and her sister Flora, who was a vaudeville performer, and I had a separate room they had set up for people to live there, and I was house sitting for a couple who lived there. And every night about 7:00, Margaret and her sister Flora would come next door, literally, and bring tea and crumpets, which is about how English can you get. And we'd sit and talk for about a half hour, 45 minutes, and she would share stories with me about JLB and her studying fishes in Southern Africa. And some of the stuff, people would be horrified to hear these stories now, but Margaret, when she was a young woman, she was a very good swimmer and stuff, and she would go out in the field, and JLB was older, 20 years older, and he had some health issues. And so stories they'd tell me is like, they'd go out on these pristine reefs, like in Mozambique, and this is how they used to do things, so don't be horrified about this, but he would dynamite the reefs, and all these fishes would float up dead. And so Margaret, being a swimmer, she would go swimming around and collecting all the fish. And she asked me the question, she goes, Dave, there used to be a lot of sharks would come in swimming around when I was collecting the fish. And I kind of look at JLB, and I said, is it okay here? There's a lot of big sharks swimming around. He goes, don't worry about them. They won't bother you. And so the guy has his wife swimming around in the water collecting all these dead fish that were coming up. And he said, don't worry, sharks don't bother you. They won't bother you or anything. And so, which is mostly true, I'm sure. I don't know what kind of sharks they were, but she said some of them were pretty big. But she'd shared some of those stories, and I really became to appreciate this thought, like, here's this young woman in the 30s and 40s and 50s, really still, going out and collecting this stuff. And she made quite a name for herself, and she was very accomplished in what she did. And she illustrated a lot of the fishes that JLB would describe. But she was kind of in his shadows until after he passed away and set up this institute, that she really kind of came into her own. But she's a very accomplished woman. If you ever want to go look up some of the stuff she did, but she really helped drive his legacy. So anyway, that was a little bit of a side story there, but this was the kind of opportunities I talk about. Like, I went to look for lost sharks, but I had some amazing stories, like, meeting Margaret Smith, and I met a number of other people. I talk about going to the grocery store and standing there getting some groceries, and I got Desmond Tutu standing next to me. We're kind of standing in line at the checkout counter, just shooting the breeze, very casual and stuff. And because I was there at a very dynamic time in South Africa's history, and if people again, if they know anything about, like, February 11th, 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison and came down and gave a speech at the Grand Parade in Cape Town. I was there because it wasn't, because it was all this stuff was going on. I thought, oh, it's kind of interesting to experience some of this stuff. I was kind of the outsider.
In the making, right? Everybody knew that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And where I was based at the South African Museum, I used to look at Parliament was literally right outside my front window, and so I would go. I have to walk by there every day to go to the gym I was going to at the time, and I would see all these guys: Mandela, Tutu, several other people. De Klerk, because they'd be going in and out of Parliament for different parliamentary meetings at the time. And so I was there at a very transformative time. And that was some of the big rewards I got out of that, working with Leonard, having the opportunity to go there and work with Leonard. But talking about working with Leonard, that was an interesting experience as well, because Leonard was an interesting guy. Like, if you knew him, like when I knew him in California, he was a really good guy. If you got to know him, he's very generous. I learned a ton of stuff from him. But when I was a student, it was a little different in the sense, and I won't go into all the details here. They'll be in my forthcoming memoirs. But I could go to his office and I'd sit there and ask him some questions and stuff, and I'd get like, yeah, oh, okay, yep, sounds good to me. Very little interaction. But then him and I would go out and have dinner, usually, 2, 3, 4 nights a week. And, this is when I was in town. And then I just wanted to have a tape recorder going, because it would just be a complete data dump. He'd just go on about this and that, and I was just going in one of the papers that I recommend, if you look on my Instagram posts and on Facebook, was a 1990 paper he did on alternative life history styles of Chondrichthyan fishes through time and space. It is, if you're any kind of a serious shark researcher, conservationist, this is like a mandatory paper you need to read. And you can find it, go into my Instagram, you can find the citation there. It's Environmental Biology of Fishes, 1990. But it was, him and I would spend hours there, long after we'd finished a pizza and stuff, and just talk about this, because he was bouncing ideas. I realized that he was bouncing ideas off me, and I was just like a young PhD student. He's asking me questions about different things, and so that was really an exciting time. And again, it just reinforced with me, like, this was the guy I needed to meet on my journey that made the huge difference. And one of the more direct things, so that was really amazing. But like I say, going out and having a pizza, we'd have lunch. And it was just like, we'd spend hours. I mean, literally like 3-4 hours would go by. They'd be closing down the pizza place. Yeah. And then we'd kind of go for a walk back to the lab. And he was just, at that point, he was real chatty. For me personally, one of the coolest things I experienced there was, one of the things that people got to know me early on was, I did a lot of observational field studies on foraging, hunting and sharks. And one of the things I came on was that big sharks will hunt in packs. And the main one was 7-gill sharks. But I've seen other white sharks and other sharks. People don't realize, but they will hunt in groups, in coordinated groups. I refer to it as social facilitation. And I was just trying to, and this is, again, the beauty of working with Leonard, was that I was talking with him, a couple nights that we're having our pizza. And I said, Leonard, I'm watching these sharks feed. I've seen this all over the world, California, South Africa, Namibia. And I go, they're not just random killing machines, as, the Jaws movie suggested, but there's a coordinated effort was going on. And it wasn't just this one lone marauder shark, that certain types of prey, like for example, if they were taking a sea lion, that these 7-gills would gang up on him. And he goes, I got a couple books for you to read. And this is where Leonard he's known as a shark person, but he could talk to you about wildlife in general, birds, all kinds of stuff. And so he said, I got a couple books for you to read. So he went back to his office, and he gave me a book called The Spotted Hyena by Hans Krook, and another book called The Serengeti Lion by George Schaller. And I literally went back to my office, and I couldn't stop reading. I just read through these books over a couple of days. I just couldn't stop reading them. And I was just went back to Leonard and said, Leonard, this is it. because in those books it talked about how lion prides and hyena groups work cooperatively within the group. And it talked about it got into a lot about how they hunt as a group and just all the strategies. And I was just like going, this is what these sharks are doing. Just the problem is because they live in a marine environment that we can't watch them all the time. We can't, you can watch like hyenas and lions feed because you can sit in a Land Rover and at a distance and watch what they're doing, how they hunt. And I was just like, this is what, and again, lions and hyenas, depending on what they're hunting, they will work in a cooperative group to take down large prey. And I'm like, this is what the seven gills will do. And other large sharks, that if you're taking on a large species that one couldn't do, they'll work in a cooperative group. Yeah. And so that was one of the most just amazing experiences I had learning stuff. But that's just one example of several I could give where Leonard was just thinking outside the box, which is where I was going. We're like, okay, here's some cool stuff. And he asked about like where I got onto the lost shark stuff. It was all during my informative years, grad school. And because besides people knowing me for doing a lot of, because my background was really in ecology, feeding ecology, reproduction, but, looking at how these sharks hunt. But one of the other things people got to know me for was I was the guy who would find these weird sharks. We didn't use the term lost shark at the time. That came later. But I was like, if you want to find the weird or the unusual, the little known sharks, just follow Dave. And because I would go out in the field and I'd find these things, and I didn't know initially at first, I'd find these sharks. Wow, this is kind of an interesting one. And I'd bring it back to the lab and show Leonard, and Leonard would go like, oh, geez, we haven't seen this shark in 80 years. We haven't seen this shark in 100 years. And so, again, this is back in sort of the, late 1980s. I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of cool. I got onto this like, okay, so there's this need out here that people are these, where I'd go, we're catching sharks that people weren't aware of. And again, there was no real field of shark conservation at the time. And so, again, people kind of got to know like, oh, if you want to go find some weird sharks, go follow Dave. And people would go to like Namibia, people would go to Taiwan, California, and they'd go like, where's Dave been? Because they knew wherever I'd been, that was where they were going to find the weird sharks, if I haven't found them already. And so that's kind of how the whole lost shark thing started, was just me going out finding these things, and then Leonard saying, oh, we haven't seen this shark for 100 years. And then also, I'd bring back a lot of species that Leonard would look at and go, well, this is an entirely new species to science. So I thought, well, this is kind of cool, because it was totally something nobody was doing. And nobody really does today still. Goes and looks for these lost sharks. They don't really, a lot of them just, it's been a process you pick up over years, to decades to learn this type of stuff. So that was a very, really informative thing to do. And kind of during the course of this thing, I talked to Leonard about villages I'd go to and places I'd travel around Africa, and I was trying to explain to some of these people, like, how to identify things. And of course, this is the 1980s, so you didn't have resources like you do now, like PDFs and email and cell phones. So we ended up writing.
Probably had some like keys, probably had some identification keys that may or may not have been up to date, right?
Right. So there really was nothing to use. So there was this book, A Guide to the Sharks and Rays of Southern Africa, that kind of really sprung from this need for this field guide. And Leonard, being a birder, we set the book for like a bird guide to make it simple and easy for the average person to be able to key through it and to be able to identify the sharks. And Ann Hecht, who was the wife of another advisor of mine, a key person, Tom Hecht, who's head of the department, did all the illustrations, which at the time, they were really, really amazing. And the thing in this book, because it was published in 1989. I'm a grad student. I'm writing my first book. I'm still in my 20s, and I've talked about this. The one thing it was so good working with Leonard was that on my own, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence at that age to do my own book. But working with him, I learned how to do a book, and it really gave me confidence for later on when I went and did my next book. Which I ended up being a solo effort years later. And, But when we're doing that book, and again, this was like Leonard thinking outside the box. Him and I'd be having these discussions, and we got into this whole area of talking about like, I go to these different villages and places in Africa, and I would see things like sharks being finned, the livers being taken for oil. And,
right.
Nobody was even thinking about shark, Chinese been using shark fins for soup for generations, like literally like hundreds of years, but nobody thought about it. And Leonard, growing up in San Francisco, he grew up near Chinatown. So he'd wander around as a young boy. So he saw the fins. Basically, him and I arrived at the same place, just in different routes and different paths. But we thought it was kind of curious. Yeah. And this led to a whole discussion on like, well, how many sharks are killed a year? So we got into this whole discussion. And like, nobody, nobody in the 1980s was thinking about like how many sharks are caught in bycatch and are killed.
No.
Nobody. And so I ended up writing a section, and I've posted this before on social media, but I'll just hang it up. I'll show it up here again. If I can find it here somewhere. Let me see here. I should have marked this before he came on the air, but anyway, in this book, I wrote this.
No worries.
No, anyway, I have it here. Just one second. I got to find this thing.
Yeah, no problem.
Let me see here. Okay. Here it is. Sorry. There's a section in the back of this book. If you get a copy of it, it's a classic book now, on page 143, called Conservation and Management. And that was the first time that I didn't know this at the time, but that was the first time anybody had ever written anything on the conservation of sharks and rays. And in that section, so I can't explain how revolutionary that was. Nobody had ever done that. And I've talked with Sarah Fowler, who's been on our podcast, and she was really one of the really founders that laid the foundation for future conservation in sharks and rays. And she was kind of heading in that direction at the same time, but I don't believe anybody had ever published that. And in that section, I commented on like, well, how many sharks and rays are caught a year? And Leonard, being Leonard, went home after our pizza night and wrote up this whole thing, did some calculations, and we estimated that between 10 and 63 million sharks a year were caught in bycatch fisheries. And we figured on average there's probably around 38 million, somewhere in there. Well, this is 1989. It was in the early 2000s, like 12, 15 years later, that colleague Shelley Clark actually did a more quantitative estimate and calculated that about 73 million sharks were caught a year. Average was around, I think she came up with a similar average of us, around 38 million or so as well. I don't remember the exact number, but I know her numbers were almost spot on with what Leonard and I had calculated back in 1989. And so that was pretty good, but that was really the first estimate ever published on the number of sharks caught a year, and that was in 1989. Again, people weren't even, I can't even explain this to young people. It wasn't even on the radar. And also in that section, we talked about the whole we referred to as a shadowy fishery of shark finning. And again, nobody was really talking about that until 20, 30 years later. Nowadays, people talk about shark finning and shark liver oil, but here we were writing on this, and it was more from how's this impacting shark populations? We didn't know, but we put it out there as a question, and we wrote up that this was going on. And species like, again, I would see these like sawfish, for example, they were kind of a nuisance if they were caught in African villages, but also at the same time, it'd be food for the community. But also, like they have these Chinese buyers who go around buying up the fins. And so with these fins that were being landed, they impacted because then they're worth a lot more money. And so that was some of the stuff with Leonard. I'm sharing a lot of these different stories, but that was the uniqueness with Leonard. That's what set him apart. And that's the kind of stuff that really made him a giant in the field. And I don't say that lightly. He really was he was a big guy personally, but physically he was a big guy, but he was, just really that guy that's thinking in a different plane. And, I finished up my PhD. We did a lot of stuff. Leonard's I've very heavily published with Leonard, and kind of a cool thing years later, as I mentioned earlier, when he was doing the Sharks of the World, the FAO guide, and was published in '84, I always thought that'd be kind of cool to do my own book on the Sharks of the World. Well, in 2013, Leonard and I co-authored a book with Mark Dando and Sarah Fowler on the Sharks of the World. And so that was kind of brought my journey full circle in a way with Leonard. At that point, Leonard was kind of on his way out in his career, and he didn't really do a heck of a lot, but he was pretty much retired. He was starting to have a lot of health issues at that time, but it was just kind of nice to have that one little thing, having done that. And of course I've gone on and done a lot of other things now, but it was nice. And I have just a lot of good memories. It was a lot of funny stories that are probably a little off color to tell on the podcast, but I'll put that somewhere else. Catch me at a conference over a beer. I'll tell you some other ones, but he had some interesting stuff. One story I will share, I think I've shared this before. I know Andrew's heard this one, but Paul Calley, and I want to give a mention to Paul Calley, who was kind of my partner in crime with the at the time. We were co-grad students together, and Paul and I just had some amazing experiences with Leonard and stuff. But one of the things I talk about some of my public presentations is Paul and I'd go off to Namibia, and at that time there was nothing there. There's no communications, no GPS, no cell phone. And so I'd tell Leonard, which was a little sketchy, and tell other people that we're going to be gone for 8 weeks. And if you didn't hear from us in 10 weeks, you might send somebody to look for us. And off we'd go. Well, again, this is back in the late 80s, and you didn't have things like, when you had your student bursary would come through each month, it would be automatic. Nowadays, it's automatically deposited. Well, back then, you had to physically go pick up your check. Well, when you're gone for 8 weeks in the field, there's nobody there to deposit your check. And on our first trip to Namibia, we wound up in a place called Lüderitz, which is literally like the end of the world. If you want to get lost, go to Lüderitz. It was at that time it was a Wild West town. Literally, it was there'd be like drunken bar fights. There'd be people passed out in the street. It was a Wild West town, but there was thousands of 7-gill sharks in the lagoon there, and so we spent some time there, and we ran out of money. I mean, literally, neither of us had a penny in our accounts, and so we had like 3,000 kilometers to get home. So I bummed some money off one of the guys there we knew, and just like literally it was like $3,000, which was like $2 at the time. And I made a phone call back to ask Leonard if he could put in a couple hundred, like literally like 300 Rand, so we had gas to get home. And I got a hold of Leonard, and he asked, of course, Leonard, brevity was not synonymous with Leonard. He could talk. And so he would share he'd say, "Oh, how's it going?" Blah, blah, blah. I say, "Oh, yeah, it's going really good, Leonard. But, we ran out of money. Can you put some money, a few hundred Rand, maybe 300 Rand, so I can get home, just for gas, not even for food?" And he's like, "Well, money's kind of tight." And he hung up on me. And that was the second time he hung up on me. I told the story earlier. And so here you got a couple of your two grad students at the time, 3,000 kilometers from home in the a-hole of the world place. And I don't want to say that to be disrespectful, but it was a tough place to be.
It wasn't a nice, it was a rough place.
No,
yeah.
It was a rough place. And so I have to go back and bum another few Rand. And I called Tom Heck back, who was the head of the department at the time, and said, "Hey, Tom, I need some money to get home." And he's like, "Well, did you talk to Leonard?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, he hung up on me." And, Tom being German, he's like, there's silence at first. He's like, no problem, Dave. I'll put $500 in your account tomorrow morning. You'll be able to withdraw it, and, welcome home. Have a safe drive. And so,
yeah,
but that was like Leonard. He just didn't have like a lot of empathy. Like, "Oh, well, you're stuck."
Yeah.
"Oh, well, good luck. See you sometime.
Hope you get home."
Hope you get home. And, but yeah. But that was kind of some of the funny stories we'd have. Paul and I just had an amazing experience. We'd go, Leonard and I would go out. We used to go a lot of times out just wildlife looking. We'd go out to game, we'd take a couple days.
Yeah.
Leonard liked to bird. I like to look at the game animals. We'd go out to a lot of the parks, national parks
like
there.
A fellow explorer kind of thing.
Yeah, we're definitely fellow explorers. And as I say, it was an amazing time in my life. And Leonard and I remained, good friends. About the last sort of 10 years of his life, he declined a lot, health-wise, physically and mentally. And so we kind of really lost touch there just because he was in South Africa and wasn't in good health. The last time I saw him was about 10 years ago. But even though he's gone now, I have just a lot of very fond memories working with him. We published a lot together. We co-authored about 10 species together. And in fact, he's the most done. It was an amazing time, and it was just I kind of, if I had to impart anything off to any young people there, you should be so lucky in your career to find someone who's that real fellow traveler, because he wasn't just an advisor, he was a mentor, and above all, he was a friend. And his late wife Martina, probably one of the biggest compliments I ever received was we're out. I was showing them, they were out visiting California one time before she passed away in 2006, and we're talking at a restaurant, and Leonard went to go use the bathroom, and I kind of apologized to her because she was a cephalopod biologist, but I kind of said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. Leonard and I are just blabbing away nonstop." And she goes, "Dave, don't worry about it." She goes, "Leonard, everybody that contacts Leonard wants something from him. You're like one of his few true friends out there." And that really touched me a lot, and it was very nice to hear that, because and that's true. Leonard had a lot of people who were not always looked out for his best interest, and just hearing that from him was very genuine. And I know and I know other people could share similar stories. I have a whole bunch of stories. One of the things, I think we got a little clip we'll have with Gavin Naylor here, and Gavin was a young PhD student. In fact, Gavin had finished before me, and he'd come to South Africa when I was still there, which I won't go into the stories today because it's just a bonus episode. Maybe I'll share in some other future episodes. But he came to South Africa in 1989. He was there for about 6 weeks, and we had just some incredible experience with Leonard, and Gavin and I still to this day laugh at some of the stories that took place that time working with Leonard, because I say Leonard was a character. If you had the chance to meet him, he was a character is the best way I could describe it. And as I say, Gavin, we were both young students at the same time, and I know he also had a profound effect on him as well. And in fact, Gavin's done a lot of the genetic work that's shown that Leonard's 1973 classification really has held up over the last 50 years. And so, anyway, I just appreciate people listening to stories. Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say before we kind of end off here, like from some of the stories that you mentioned, I didn't know, with the relationship you had with him, but also he's the reason why you're the lost shark guy. I think that's pretty cool. You would go to him to like bring back the specimens that you had, and you would be like, "What is this?" Like, and he'd be like, "Oh, we haven't seen this in like 10 years." And it's kind of interesting because before we recorded, we were talking about how people come to you now to be that person, that authority to come in and say, "Hey, I found this. What is it?" And you're like, "Oh, well, we actually haven't seen that in 5 years. Or we haven't seen that in 10 years. Or we haven't seen that in 20 years. Or this is a new species. Like, let's work on this together." And I think that it just goes to show that you're kind of like continuing the legacy that Leonard had, in terms of just knowing the species so much and being so interested in all the species, not just the iconic sharks, not just the great white shark, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just he just had this impeccable knowledge of and detailed knowledge of all the sharks, hence the book, The Sharks of the World, and what you have lived on in terms of that legacy, and continued on with that legacy and built your own legacy as the lost shark guy for a reason, because you're the one who continues on that curiosity that you both had and you both shared. And I think it's really funny because there is this relationship with a supervisor and a student that a lot of people have, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. But you got to see him in two lights. You got to see him at work and in the office, but you also got to see them outside of work, where he seemed to be a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more he's interested in talking about science. He's interested in talking about sharks. Like, he had a genuine interest, birds, whatever species, game species. And I think that's really interesting to hear, to see like a supervisor who has that kind of relationship with student, where you guys were not only colleagues or not even student, like mentor student, but you were genuine friends. And I think that's really cool to see.
Yeah, no, he laid the foundation for, let's say, we didn't use, back in the 80s, I didn't think about the term lost shark guy or any, or lost sharks, but he really laid the foundation. And if I impart something to young people listening to shows, like, be knowledgeable about all the sharks and rays. Don't focus on one species. Just be knowledgeable. The wider, the broader width of knowledge you have, the better. The more you'll know, and the more you learn, the more questions you could ask. And as I say, I just, I never thought I was going to, the direction I've gone. I'm kind of a direction I never thought about. But when as I learned more about all the different species, and I started bringing back these different things that people hadn't seen, I thought, well, that's kind of a cool thing. Nobody else is doing this. And it just was literally, so I've started doing that, and I started focusing. I didn't focus in on them because I just go look for what was there and document stuff. But then when Leonard started telling me, like, a number of these species had not been seen for decades, and 20, 30 years or more, then I started going okay. Then I started paying attention to, and started keeping a database of like, well, how long of some of these sharks haven't been seen. And there were sharks that I can tell you there were sharks I found back in the 80s that haven't been seen since I found them. I mean, I know where to go back to find them, but it's sure. Like, because I know where they are, and I think that I call them lost, but I think if someone bothers to go look for them, you know where to go. But I've just kind of carried on with that, and that led to my sort of moniker, my brand now, the Lost Shark Guy. Over the
Your
last
expertise really is what it is.
Yeah, my expertise over the last couple decades. That's really what it's led to. And I have such a network now. I get people all over the world contact me every week. I go a few days a week. I get emails from people asking me to identify stuff from them. And, a lot of times it's like, oh, this is that and stuff. But sometimes I get some really cool stuff that, hey, we haven't seen this species in 40 years. Literally, and they show up here. And I'm like, so then I can help them out and provide them some more information. So it's kind of cool. Yeah. And, one of the things with Leonard is like, he always, and I think people listen to the podcast or hear me talk, I still have that enthusiasm, that passion I had when I was 5 years old. And Leonard was the same way. He was like, he would have been 81 this December. But he was just that perpetual kid, where he never lost his enthusiasm. And I had that same thing where I still feel today, like, I'm going to keep going till I can't, which, will probably be when they drop me in the ground. And
I love it.
And
not anytime soon. That's for sure.
Not anytime soon. Well, if you listen to the recent podcast I did on my trip to Indonesia and Timor-Leste, you can tell that, and I think one thing with the Lost Shark stuff now is I enjoy working with a lot of the young people, like the crew I was just working with in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. I love working with young people and passing along, because now it's my turn to pass along that information to all these young people, and they'll hopefully be the new Lost Shark guys and gals in the future. And that would be my biggest legacy, is to impart my knowledge to a lot of these really up and coming people, many of whom we've had on the podcast. So I just, keep going on, and all that was instilled with me with Leonard. And Leonard, some of these days I'll see you in that big shark park in the sky one day, and I'm sure be back having a pizza and a Coca-Cola, even though I don't really like Coca-Cola. I would
talking.
So, but yeah, it was phenomenal experience. And I'll just, one last shout out. If you ever see you guys, particularly young people, if you see me at a conference sometime, just come up and say hi. I'm pretty approachable, and just want to talk about Leonard stories and some of the stuff. I'm more than happy to share.
And sharks.
Sharks, yeah. And just talk to you about stuff. And so anyway, Andrew, I appreciate it. Everybody, I just listened to the show, and thanks for having a chance to part some of my stuff, because it was a big thing in my life. Met Leonard and getting to know Leonard, and I just like I say, I hope to see him again sometime in the next life. So Anyway, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And thank you everyone for listening, and keep on trucking, baby, as Leonard would say. So
I love it. Well, Dave, thank you so much for sharing these stories. I know this is a hard time for you. You can tell in your voice, you can tell that Leonard had such an impact on your life as well as others. When you posted in the American Lasbranch Society the notice of that he had passed, there's so many amazing things that people have said about him, recounting stories and how much of a legend that he was in this industry and in this field. So you're not the only one who feels this, but definitely you had a different relationship with him because you were his student, and you did his PhD with him, and obviously a lot more than that. So we appreciate you being vulnerable with us and you letting us know more about Leonard, and I appreciate it definitely as a friend, and we hope for the best. And like you said, one day you'll be reunited and having a Coke, having a pizza, and talking sharks. It's awesome. Yep. So thank you so much. Yep. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
Dave Ebert has asked me to comment on the contributions of Leonard Campagno, who passed away last week. I've known Leonard since I was a graduate student, and he's certainly a very unusual person. He was frankly obsessed with sharks and rays. He wanted to understand everything about them. He wanted to understand their anatomy, their behavior, their life history, their taxonomy, and he would pursue any avenue to learn more about them. We're familiar with Leonard because of his influential publication record. But I put it to you that really is the tip of the iceberg. What Leonard published was a tiny fraction of what he knew. Instinct is nothing more than a capacity to access a huge amount of context-sensitive information. And it seemed that Leonard had tremendous instinct for understanding these animals. And that's because he had huge knowledge about these animals from all of his work. On a daily basis, he would be trying to find out more about them. As a person, he was fairly diffident, fairly shy, and really uncomfortable in public settings. But if you were somebody who was interested in the same things as Leonard was, he was amazing. Whenever I would meet with Leonard, I'd really look forward to it, because just a few minutes with Leonard would provide tremendous insights. He would make these casual observations about sharks and rays as if everybody knew about them, but they might be casual for Leonard, but they'd be profound statements to the rest of us. So I'm particularly sad that Leonard passed away, because he carries with him so much knowledge of these animals. And also, I don't think that he's as widely appreciated by young scientists as he is by older colleagues. Many young scientists I've talked to never even heard of Leonard. But he's somebody to look up to aspire to be like. He was primarily deeply curious. And I, for one, will miss him. It's a huge loss to ichthyology and a personal loss to me.